Hello, thank you all so much for tuning in today. Welcome to the New Mexico Main Street Historic Preservation for Main Street District Streets and Landscapes webinar. This is the second in our series of webinars that we've focused on historic preservation. My name is Anna Bly. I'm the Communications and Media Specialist here at Main Street, and today's session will be presented by Revitalization Specialist Amy Bell, who will offer a unique perspective related to historic preservation and sites within Main Street districts as opposed to our buildings. Hello, Amy, and welcome.
Hello, thank you, Anna, and thanks to everyone for joining us today for this webinar, which is a topic that I think is really interesting and really important because it kind of touches, all of the placemaking and work that we do, in our Main Street districts that's not on the face of or in the buildings. So I was excited to have the opportunity to put this presentation together because it's an important part of our process for a lot of the design and placemaking projects that we're working on. So again, my name is Amy Bell. I am the Landscape Architectural Urban Planning Revitalization Specialist. And so sites and streetscapes and landscapes are the things that I am excited about. So jumping into the presentation here, I want to just talk a little bit about the importance of historic preservation in the work that we're doing in our Main Street districts, because it really is sort of at the core of our goal is to maximize and leverage our historic assets for economic development, and our historic assets include all of those things around the buildings, all of the things that connect the buildings. So while I think a lot of times we think about historic preservation in terms of buildings, there's really a lot more, and we have a lot more going in terms of our historic assets in our communities and the spaces in between. So, and I wanted to just sort of say to start out as well that and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouths, but I know sometimes the historic preservation review or having to deal with historic preservation coordination can sometimes get a bad rap. It sort of potentially is seen as kind of a roadblock, and I think that the cool way that we have it set up and the partnership that we have with the State Historic Preservation Division is really counter to that. It's really a good thing. Our goal is by integrating historic preservation and understanding our historic assets, we're building better public spaces, places that really authentically represent our heritage while continuing to serve the community in the present and the future, and doing that in a better way. And I think that I want to just emphasize in this presentation that the State Historic Preservation Division is a really invaluable resource, and they're really willing to help. And they helped me put this presentation together. And so I have to thank Carla McWilliams for giving me some really great case study examples. So I think, the historic preservation considerations and review is really just a way that we make the work that we do better. So starting off, where do we start when we're working on a project? Say we want to do a parklet design, or we want to do a paving inlay and a streetscape, or we want to look at doing a community garden area. Any of the types of projects that we look at, doing a streetscape renovation like the Great Blocks projects. How do we tell if our project site is quote unquote historic or historically significant? And there's a couple of real clear ways to know, and then there's some squishier stuff that will help us figure out whether or not it's historic. And I would make that comment about sites in terms of historic preservation in relation to buildings in historic preservation is that some of the site stuff is a little squishier than the building requirements or definitions, and so that's why I think this presentation is a really great idea, because it helped me solidify some of the considerations and requirements for sites as opposed to buildings, make them a little less squishy or subjective, and hopefully it will for you all as well. So the first way we can know if a site is historic is if it is listed on the state or national historic register. You can find out if it's on the National Register by going to the National Park Service website, which you've got on the screen there. And if it's on the state register, it's real easy to contact the state. Usually if it's on the National Register, it's on the state register. Sometimes if it's on the state register, it may not be on the national. But again, the State Historic Preservation Division office is our resource in that matter. So if it's in a historic district, so the site itself could be listed, that's a possibility. More frequently though, the site will be located within a historic district. And so I've got an example here of the historic district in Silver City. It's typically described by the street boundaries. So this is something that would be really common for a lot of you in your communities. This is, it would be bounded by, like this says College Street and Black and Lion Street. So, if you're doing a project within this boundary, it's in the historic district, and probably you should be talking to HPD, just kind of keeping them informed. The other important part of this is that if it is listed on the state or national register, or it's in a historic district, there is a period of significance. And so, like for Silver City, it's 1870 to 1920s, which is that's a pretty decent range. Sometimes it's more specific, but typically, when we're talking about kind of appropriate contextual understanding with respect to the historic properties or the historic character, that period of significance is pretty important. And then the other thing HPD is great about is if for some reason your community does have a historic district, or the project site is listed, HPD will get us the listing so that we can read it, the nomination, we can understand what's in there, and use that to help us understand what we need to preserve or protect or highlight in the project. So does your site need to be on the register or in a historic district to be considered historic? No. much more is considered historic. If your site is 50 years old or older, or potentially, and this is where it gets squishier, it could be younger and it still could be considered historic. And that's why it's always good to check. If significant modifications have been made to something that's over 50 years old, it may not be considered historic or significant or contributing. But again, that's why it's good to check. Typically, we're dealing with sites that are public property versus private property. I have talked with the folks at HPD at some length about historic tax credits and whether or not, if you're renovating a building, if what you do to the site affects those tax credits. And basically their answer has been no. So there's potentially a little bit less of a concern about what happens with the landscape around a privately owned building. But again, it all just sort of depends on your coordination with HPD and their take on the matter. I wanted to mention here as well cultural landscapes, which are typically defined by the National Park Service. So those are probably in most cases going to be outside of the Main Street conversation, but not always. You know, for example, the Santa Fe Plaza has had a cultural landscape inventory and cultural landscape report completed, and same with the Taos Plaza. And it's possible, you know, there's other ones. I didn't really look comprehensively into how many plazas have the cultural landscape reports. But generally that means, you know, the federal government's involved, National Park Service is involved. And honestly, if you have a cultural landscape inventory and report for your project site, that's a really, really cool resource, because there's generally, well, the report will include specific recommendations for improvements. So the Taos Plaza CLR cultural landscape report has very specific recommendations for design improvements, and so that's a really great guiding document. It's going to very clearly identify stuff that needs to remain, stuff that needs to be preserved, stuff that, you know, may not be considered significant and so is not important to preserve. So those documents are great, but we probably don't have them for most of the sites that we're working on within our Main Street districts. So ultimately, the point I want to get across is that, you know, working on any project in any of our Main Street districts, we probably need to ask the question, is it historic? And that's what we're here for. Your revitalization specialists are here to help you answer that question and talk to Historic Preservation Division and figure that out. So we are here for you to help sort that out. Okay, so what am I talking about when I talk about all the stuff that's not buildings? Common sites that are historic include, of course, our streetscapes. This is a picture of some of the recent improvements to the Los Alamos streetscape, Main Street. And you can see that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more with some of our other case studies at the end of the presentation. Just because it's in a historic district, just because it's considered historic, does not mean you can't make significant improvements to it. You know, and I like this example because it shows, you know, there's the curb extensions, the bump outs at the end there, which make it safer for pedestrians. There's the landscape parkway areas in there. Looks like they've got some water harvesting, green infrastructure. So, you know, again, historic preservation is a lens through which we make the design better. It's not a roadblock to improving pedestrian safety and environmental conditions. Another obviously common historic site are our plazas. Some of the, you know, oldest landscapes and oldest parts of our cities and towns are the plaza at the center for various reasons. This is the plaza in Socorro. Courthouse grounds. This is the courthouse in Santa Rosa. So again, you know, typically a central, often a central part of our Main Street districts. Although there is the agency interaction between county and city with the county courthouses, but these are usually going to be historic. And surprisingly enough, there are a lot of historic parks in the state. This Pioneer Women's Park in Las Cruces. On the left-hand side there is, you know, again, just one of the oldest parts of the city. And on the right-hand side is Spruce Park in Albuquerque. It's been really interesting because I've had the opportunity to work with New Mexico State Forestry this last year on tree inventories in all 33 county seats in the historic district. And so that's been a really interesting way to start to understand the historic landscapes in all of our communities, and kind of looking at these historic parks. Pioneer Women's Park in Las Cruces has a lot of really old mulberry trees, and so it is a historic preservation question. As the city begins to replant, how they preserve that historic character and integrity, potentially without planting a whole bunch more mulberries, because there's a lot of other tree species that are more appropriate for the environment and more appropriate for the use of the space. But it is an interesting conversation, and that can be where it does start to get a little bit subjective, but we do have guidelines to help direct us. Other historic sites, cemeteries, obviously, and another part of our older landscapes. And I wanted to note, again, this is not something that applies probably to any of our Main Street districts, but national cemeteries are all considered to be historic sites. And so veterans cemeteries too, in particular. So this is a picture of Pat Garrett's grave in Las Cruces. Pat Garrett is apparently the gentleman who shot and killed Billy the Kid. It's been really interesting. On this tree inventory, we've had various connections to Billy the Kid in various cemeteries all over the state. But that, again, I think that speaks to the importance of including historic preservation in our design process, because it's a really critical part of our storytelling, and it makes places more interesting. Okay, so this is a really interesting, pretty cool feature in Carrizozo, in their oldest city park, McDonald Park, which is right next to their Main Street. And I like this image because I think it's a nice conversation piece to start to look at what historic preservation is about, and how it's often a conversation. It's not, the answer is not black or white. It's often gray. It's often a compromise, because it's not about sort of freezing that community in time, that period of significance. Historic preservation doesn't say, okay, the period of significance is 1930 to 1940, and everything in the historic district shall look like it did during that time period forevermore. It's not about that. It's about developing improvements that are compatible with the surrounding content text, so it respects the context of the historic character, but also addresses current needs and styles. And so I do want to recognize that this is somewhat subjective and can be contentious, right? I mean, this is something that's probably happened in a lot of your communities, where certain people have certain opinions about what is historic and what should be preserved and what's important, and other folks feel differently about it. And so, when we think about the community engagement that we need to do for these design projects, I think that's an important conversation that we need to have, and including HPD in that conversation, or helping them facilitate that conversation, can be really useful, because they have a more objective approach to it, and have good questions that we can ask to help our community members reach consensus on this stuff. And the HPD follows the Secretary of the Interior standards, and so that's something too. If y'all are interested in kind of what they use as their guiding principles, you can look those up on the National Park Service website and see what those are. And those are for preservation, renovation, rehabilitation, different scenarios. But again, they sort of pose some of those questions that help guide the conversation, so that these important decisions can be made. Okay, so we have a project, new construction, and we need to engage with the Historic Preservation Division. These are some basic guidelines for when HPD needs to be involved. And I would say basically, for any of our projects, HPD needs to be involved. But just so you guys know, if there's federal money involved, if there's federal permit or licensing, state agency involvement, which is, again, really all of our projects, if there's state money involved, or if it's the work of a city or county. So again, I mean, not all of this stuff, but one of these things probably applies. And I think, as many of you know, New Mexico Main Street and the Historic Preservation Division do have a memorandum of understanding to cooperate, to work together, to reach positive outcomes for these projects. So, and I wanted to note here too that, from my understanding of, how we make this go smoothly, we want to engage HPD as early as practical in the design process. So when is that? Is that, from the very beginning of the project? Is it, sometimes we might want to wait until we actually have a design proposal. Sometimes it may be appropriate to, give HPD a call and say, hey, this community is thinking about doing this project. I'll do that. Like I've got here, this is a process that is facilitated by your revitalization specialists. And so that's something that I can help you with. Will or Amy Barnhart can help with it as well, and give them a call and say, hey, this community is thinking about doing this. Are there any particular red flags we should look for? And then for sure, once you've got, consensus has been reached on particular design improvements, then absolutely you want to share that information. I will help you, your revitalization specialist will help you share that information with HPD and get their review and their take on it. So what is that process? Again, we would help you contact HPD. Then there's that determination if historic properties are involved, which again, I think, for most of our projects, they probably are. I think we want to sort of assume that they are, err on the side of assuming that we're going to need to consider it, and then let HPD tell us we don't if we don't. And then what happens is HPD will review the proposed improvements and make a determination of effect, which means they're going to look at, does this have an adverse effect on the historic quality of the property? And in most cases, they will provide review. If there's anything they have concerns about, they'll bring that up. We'll talk about, is there a way that we can, sort of change the design, the proposed design improvements, change the style, adjust this, tweak that, so that they'll feel that there's no adverse effect. And usually it's not anything really major with site projects if we're not proposing something totally wild and crazy. And even a lot of the wild and crazy stuff is okay too. HPD will provide a letter that says, so you have written documentation that they have reviewed it and that they have found that there is no adverse effect. And that's important, especially if the project is going to engage state, federal funding down the road. You want to have that documentation. If for some reason, we go through the process and there is an adverse effect, again, we continue to work with each other until we can figure something out, figure out a compromise. If for some reason the compromise cannot be reached, there is an opportunity to enter into an MOA to stipulate a mitigation. So the example that was given, of course, was for a building, because everything, you know, is sort of focused on the buildings. But say a building is demolished, it was historic. There's nothing that can really be done about that, but the mitigation would be to provide a, you know, commemorative historic plaques or educational seminars around what that building was, or potentially to highlight another historic building in the area. So there is an options to mitigate if a compromise can't be reached. If that MOA can't be reached, then they involve the Federal Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. I honestly don't know if that's ever happened. You know, most of the projects that I know about that are site related in the States, you know, they get to that no adverse effects letter pretty easily. Okay, so what are the things that we need to consider? And I wanted to talk about this because, again, you know, our considerations are different for site projects than they are for buildings, even though some of the language may be the same. So one of the things that that we want to consider first is, well, first we want to identify our historic elements and protect those, and that's something that we can do in concert with HPD, figure out how to protect them. Views are something that are considered to be, you know, often in the register listing and the nomination. Views are actually characterized as historically significant. So we can typically assume that views of historic buildings are going to be historically significant. Sometimes views to certain places, certain landscape features are important. And so if I didn't emphasize that enough in the beginning, it is really important to read that nomination, get the nomination from HPD, read it, see what's called out in the nomination with respect to landscape. A lot of times there's nothing. Most of the time there's nothing. But if there is, it's really important that we identify that up front. So, you know, an example of views, this is the Hotel Belen, the Belen Great Blocks project. The consultant that's working on that was very careful not to put any trees, any new trees in the streetscape in front of the historic buildings, because it's important that you preserve the views of those buildings. So that's not to say you can't put any street trees in because you're going to block views. You just have to consider sort of what are those sort of historically critical vantage points, and make sure that you're not blocking those, and whatever you're doing is going to be complementary to that building or that significant feature. Okay, again, yeah, the significant features noted in the nomination, and you know, the examples of this that I've experienced. One was when we were working on the National Cemetery in Fort Baird, down by Silver City. The ditches at that cemetery are called out in the nomination, and it was a real challenge for that design, because there's ditches that run, irrigation ditches that run across the site and pose a real accessibility issue. But because they're called out specifically in the nomination, we couldn't touch them. And I think the bridges over them were not considered historic, so there was a workaround there. But you know, the other really common one that a lot of you probably have are the WPA sidewalks and walls. And so one of the workarounds, which you see here, this is in Las Cruces, they took the marking from that sidewalk. You can see that the new sidewalk that's been laid around it is is pretty recently constructed, but they kept the marking to show that at one point there was an older sidewalk there. And I think that's been a solution in a number of communities to deal with sidewalks that are not accessible, not safe, that are deteriorating, but still recognize the historic significance. Okay, so this is a big one. This is the one that Carla Milk-Williams at HPD always mentions right off the bat, is that, you know, the point is not to take this streetscape at this particular point in time during the period of significance, you know, and this is Raton. I don't know if this picture is during the period of significance. I just picked it as kind of a, you know, generic example, but the idea is not to like keep this and replicate it henceforth forevermore into the future. It's to, you know, sort of understand the materials and the style that was used during that period of significance, and then as you make improvements, you know, kind of recognize that and complement it within the current context as well. And if that sounds squishy to some of you guys, it is a little bit, I think. But, you know, one example, you know, or another way of putting it is, if you're making a modern addition, you want to be clear that it is a modern addition. And so a lot of times, you know, a common conversation is, ooh, you know, let's include like historic looking lampposts. And, you know, absolutely, you don't want to take a historic style of lamppost from another community and plunk it down in yours, because that would be completely inappropriate. You know, if there is a very clear historic precedent set for a certain lamppost style, it's possible that maybe replicating that and then making a change to it might be appropriate. You don't want to create a situation where you're installing something new that could be mistaken for something historic. So that's something that we have to look at carefully when we're looking at the style of benches and light posts and other site furnishings, paving patterns. So it needs to be clearly distinguishable as new while still honoring the appropriate style. And that's, you know, that's again, you know, what your revitalization specialists are here for, and the consultation with HPD, because we can really help facilitate that process and look at examples of what does that mean, not to copy, but to do something that is appropriate, yet distinguishable. Another thing that's just real important to consider, and this was based on a recent conversation that I had with Carla regarding streetscape improvements and what they consider to be, you know, historically significant with regard to the street, and that's the street pattern. So that's looking at like the right-of-way width, the curb heights. I'm not sure if I got that picture in here, but yeah, it looks like I didn't. I used a different one. You know, a lot of our communities have higher curbs. Silver City does because of drainage. Other communities have the higher curbs because of the stagecoach access. And so, you know, we have to look at that and kind of balance accessibility with that historic character, so that, you know, if those curb heights are an issue for accessibility, that's a conversation that we have with, you know, the community and with HPD to figure out how do we make this accessible but still honor, you know, the history of this form. And then they do say, you know, things like, if you are looking at accessibility, a lot of times the improvements we're making, you know, are really focused on that, making these places accessible to people with mobility challenges. And so, you know, things like handrails and guardrails and those additions do need to be clearly modern additions. They need to be distinguishable as modern as opposed to part of the original historic landscape. So because, some of this stuff is a little, it's like don't copy, but make it, respecting the historic character. I wanted to pull some case studies that are doing this, and so it's a little bit more, understandable that these are all pretty reasonable requirements, and they can result in some really valuable improvements to our downtown landscapes. And so I did ask Carla, and she consulted with her colleagues at HPD for a couple of exemplary projects that show coordination with HPD and how it has been done well. And so the first one that I've got, which is not constructed yet, but the design I think is mostly completed, is Main Street in Farmington. And this is a pretty significant streetscape improvement. This is just a quick shot of the design, the plan view. These were some renderings that were done. The bottom image is a rendering that was done, I think, earlier in the process when Blue Zones was involved. But you can see, I mean, these are pretty significant streetscape improvements that are being proposed and that were determined by HPD to have no adverse effect. The back-end parking is freaking you out. I believe that's not actually part of the final design. But, I find it reassuring that, we can continue to make these important accessibility improvements, making our streets more comfortable, more accessible, better places for social interaction. And, historic preservation doesn't need to get in the way of that. It can be a very complementary process. So here you can see, the right-of-way is not changing. They're able to add bike lanes. They're able to reduce the number of vehicular lanes without actually sort of changing the street pattern, as Carla put it. The other thing that I forgot to mention before is the concept of reversibility. So if what you're proposing is considered to be reversible, it's generally going to be considered as, no adverse effect. And so as an example, Deming is looking at doing a paving inlay in their streetscape, in the asphalt, in the street. And so they're not looking at any curb changes. They're not looking at changing the right-of-way. It's just a paving change within the actual street itself. And that, initially the design has not been developed, but initially HPD has said, yeah, that sounds fine because you're not changing the street pattern and it's reversible. So.
And I did have a clarification here from Michael, who typed in that due to space considerations, they stayed with the parallel as well, parking.
Oh, for the parking? Thanks, yeah. Michael. It's the danger of showing really early design renderings right before the thing's going to be built. So just a quick summary of the HPD coordinator, and Michael may have more input on this part as well, but I think the design is complete past the point where HPD review is needed anymore. The commercial district is listed both state and national registers. HPD staff met with the folks in Farmington, and probably, I think the current consultant has been coordinating with HPD as well. HPD probably provided the written letter that determined there would be no adverse effect. And so that project is moving forward and, sort of has that additional quality of historic preservation and also the documentation so that they can use the state and federal funding. And these street sections show the right-of-way stays the same. The sidewalk width is also, looks like it's staying the same, which retains that historic street pattern. the street furnishings probably were reviewed for those qualities that we talked about. But then again, many of these changes, stuff like site furnishings even, are viewed as being reversible. So they're okay with HPD on a number of levels. Another example is the Lead-Coal Avenue streetscape improvements, and those were pretty major. If you guys remember a few years ago when that went in, it included, I believe, the addition of parkways between the sidewalk and the street, reduced the traffic to 2 lanes. So, again, like with Farmington, the right-of-way is probably staying the same, but we're doing what's called a road diet, reducing the number of traffic lanes, which reduces the visual width of the road, which typically encourages drivers to drive slower, traffic calming, which is something that we want in our downtown districts. The bump outs, which make the crossing the road distance shorter for pedestrians, those were part of this project. Sidewalk width was maintained. And again, HPD determined that there was no adverse effect. So again, there is this agreement between state agencies, and particularly between MainStreet, HPD, and DOT. And state preservation law actually requires that DOT consult with HPD on any project that's located in a historic district. So, and I would just note here that if DOT is doing a project in your community and you are not aware of them consulting with HPD, you can be happy to, or feel free to let me know. And that's something too that, particularly if it's in your MainStreet district, MainStreet Historic District, and DOT is doing a project and you aren't aware of their coordination with HPD, that's something that we can help make sure is happening as well. Another project example in Aztec, again, the bump outs making the crossing width narrower, narrowing the lanes from 3 to 2, sidewalk width was maintained, and again, HPD determined no adverse effect. But you can see here too, also there's the lighting, there's street furniture, trash receptacles, benches that were included as part of that project. And so, really good stuff can happen, even with, especially because of historic preservation involvement, I should say. So, because we only had an hour today, and I've already, oh my gosh, talked for 45 minutes, I wanted to point you guys to a couple of additional resources. So if you want to look into this more, become familiar with those Secretary of the Interior standards, I recommend doing that. Also, Carla shared with me a couple of other sort of specific resources related to streetscapes and new site construction. The Texas Historical Commission has some pretty excellent streetscape design guidelines that are available at this link. And then this other resource is the National Trust for Historic Preservation document on new construction. And I haven't delved into that one too deeply. It's a longer document, but I think that both of these documents are good resources for us as we move forward with, with our site projects. And I think, as usual, the webinar the slides will be posted so you guys can have access to these links when Anna gets those slides up. And then again, you have questions, you want more information, you are always welcome to give us a call, shoot us an email and ask. I've got my name, Will's, and Amy Barnhart on here because we're all able to answer questions, related to historic preservation and as it relates to our Main Street districts. So that's all I have, and would like to give a little time for any questions you guys might have.
Okay, I am seeing, some people wrote in some questions, but I'm going to see if I can unmute you, Michael, so you can share it with the group. If not, I'm happy to read it out to Amy too. Are you there, Michael?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep,
I can hear you. Yeah.
So, and this may be just something, I don't know. Last year we have a little historic house in our historical district, and it's unfortunately probably because it wasn't historically a commercial building, it was not included in as a contributing building for our historic commercial district. But it's a historic house, and it had some renovations on the interior that made the current owners think it was much newer than it actually is. But there's been a movement over the years to try and get it on the register or get it registered as a historic property. And unfortunately last year, and I shouldn't say unfortunately because we kind of stopped them, but last year the current owners decided that they wanted to change the facade so it looked like the commercial buildings next to it, which they also own. So it was going to lose all its character from being a kind of 1920s little bungalow maybe or something to this just flat facade 1960s construction. Luckily, I think due to some public pressure from like the owners of Three Rivers and a couple other who are really big on historic preservation, they decided to abandon that idea. But they were really keen on like changing the way the building looked entirely. I mean, it just would have lost all its character. Is there a way to like get the property protected in case they ever want to revisit that idea? Or
my understanding is that if the property is privately owned,
I know they can kind of pretty much do what they want, but
well, they can, but I mean, I think that there, as far as like the state and the federal requirements go, there's less they can do. If the city wants to enact certain, ordinances and require, historical review for improvements that property owners want to make, and then that's just something that's disclosed to them when they're purchasing the property. I know like Albuquerque, Santa Fe, have that kind of more stringent local, municipal historic review required. And so that's, when Will sits on that board for Santa Fe, so he'd probably be a really good resource for you, Michael, if you wanted to talk to him about maybe those additional levels of, regulation. Absolutely, and that we want to protect that stuff.
Yeah.
in our because I mean it's a huge part of our storytelling opportunity, and we don't want to prevent investment and development by scaring those folks off that they're going to have to follow certain requirements, but at the same time it's important. So have you talked to Will about that yet?
I haven't talked to him about
okay.
that.
I know less about the sort of the building requirements and the controls that you can put on that, but I think he knows a lot, so I would talk to him. Yeah. Well,
cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for all your clarifications, Michael, too.
Oh, you're welcome.
I appreciated getting your notes and trying to share them with Amy. So awesome discussion. All right. If there's anybody else, feel free to raise your hand. And as Amy mentioned before, of course, don't hesitate, if you're kind of driving away later or thinking about this webinar and a question comes up, please do reach out. We had a couple of lovely guests today. Thank you for the webinar, Amy. So you have some folks out there who expressed their thanks for your presentation.
Oh, good.
And we also want to thank you all for taking time out of your day, typically over your lunch break to join us. And sounds like it's been a really interesting and informative session, and we appreciate you all. And hopefully we'll see many of you soon. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone. Hope to see you in Raton.
Okay.